Nero shocked Rome when he took a man as his bride. This emperor blurred the line between power, lust, and madness. Rome was no stranger to scandal. In the golden marble halls of the empire, where gladiators fought, senators schemed, and emperors ruled like gods, whispers of debauchery and excess flowed like wine. But among all the rulers of Rome, one name towers above the rest when it comes to shocking the world with bizarre, ruthless, and forbidden desires: Emperor Nero. He was not only remembered as the man who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, but also as the emperor who dared to marry another man, crossing a line that few in ancient power ever would. Nero's story is not one of ordinary rule. It is the tale of a boy born into a dynasty soaked in blood, where politics and betrayal intertwined with passion and lust. From the very beginning, his life was shaped not by his own will, but by the schemes of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who ensured that her son would rise above rivals to wear the imperial crown. But once Nero took power, he proved that he was no puppet. Instead, he turned Rome into a stage for his wildest fantasies, where morality bowed before his desires. To understand Nero's shocking marriage to a man, one must first understand Rome itself. Ancient Rome was not like the Christianized world that would come centuries later. Same-sex relationships were not condemned in the way later societies judged them, but they came with boundaries. A Roman man could take a male lover, but only as long as he assumed the dominant role. For an emperor to marry a man as his wife, dressing him as a bride and treating him as his consort, was to defy every social code, every expectation of Roman masculinity and power. Nero's appetite for both women and men was legendary. He was known to take lovers of every kind, whether noblewomen, slaves, or freedmen. But one figure stood out in particular: a young man named Sporus. History tells us that Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Nero's deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had tragically killed in a fit of rage. Guilt, obsession, or madness, whatever the reason, Nero could not let go of Poppaea's memory. Instead, he recreated her in the form of Sporus. Sporus was more than just a lover. He was transformed. Nero had the young man castrated to prevent the growth of masculine features, making him more like the woman Nero longed for. Then, in a spectacle that stunned Rome, Nero staged a grand wedding ceremony. Dressed in bridal attire, Sporus was married to the emperor himself, who played the role of husband. The emperor of Rome, ruler of millions, the man who commanded armies and dictated laws, publicly declared a man his wife. Imagine the sight: torches blazing in the night, Roman nobles forced to attend, priests conducting rituals meant for sacred unions, and Sporus, veiled like a blushing bride, presented before the emperor. For the common Roman, such an event was not only scandalous, it was unthinkable. Yet none dared speak against it openly. Nero was more than a man. He was the living embodiment of Roman power. And when power bends the rules, society is forced to follow. To Nero, this marriage was not a parody but a fulfillment of desire and power. He did not merely take Sporus as a lover, he elevated him into the role of empress. Sporus was given titles, wealth, and public recognition. The emperor even traveled with him in public, addressing him with terms of endearment and expecting others to treat him as they would a legitimate wife of the ruler of Rome. It was both theater and reality, a blurred line where politics merged with personal lust. But Nero's marriage to Sporus was not an isolated act. It was part of a larger pattern of extravagance and disregard for Roman tradition. He spent fortunes on feasts, dressed as an actor upon the stage, and forced nobles to applaud his performances. Rome was transformed into his playground, where laws bent not to justice but to the whims of the emperor. To his enemies, this was not merely eccentricity, it was madness wearing a crown. The Roman elite were horrified, yet powerless. Senators who once commanded armies now bowed before Nero's bizarre displays. When the emperor demanded applause for his performances, they clapped until their hands were raw. When he staged his mock wedding, they attended as though it were sacred. Fear ruled them all, for Nero's cruelty was as legendary as his lust. Those who opposed him often ended up exiled, tortured, or executed. Sporus himself became both a symbol and a victim. He was paraded through Rome as Nero's empress, made to play the role of a woman in public ceremonies, stripped of the identity he once had. Some historians argue that Sporus lived in fear, trapped in a gilded cage of power and humiliation. Yet others suggest he may have accepted his role, seeing it as survival in a world where to displease the emperor meant certain death. Nero's obsession with Sporus seemed to grow stronger as his reign descended into chaos. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, when flames consumed vast swaths of the city, Nero's reputation plummeted. Many accused him of setting the fire himself, and though he rebuilt Rome with grand designs, suspicion never faded. Amidst this political turmoil, his marriage to Sporus became another reason for people to whisper that their emperor had lost all sense of Roman dignity. Yet Nero thrived on scandal. The more Rome gossiped, the more he performed. To him, the empire was his stage, and every act of defiance was a performance to etch his name into eternity. By marrying Sporus, Nero wasn't just satisfying personal desire. He was declaring himself above tradition, above morality, above the very fabric of Roman order. In his mind, he was not just an emperor. He was a god who could rewrite reality itself. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded these events with disgust. To them, Nero was the embodiment of decadence destroying Rome from within. But their writings also reveal the shock and fascination his actions inspired. Was Nero truly insane, or was he deliberately breaking norms to assert ultimate dominance? After all, nothing displays power more vividly than the ability to defy society and suffer no consequence. Sporus was not Nero's only male marriage. Before this union, Nero had also staged a wedding with another freedman, Pythagoras. In that strange ceremony, Nero himself took the role of bride, veiled and submissive, while Pythagoras played the groom. Together, they enacted rituals of Roman matrimony, reversing roles and mocking tradition. For Nero, gender, power, and desire were not boundaries but tools for his theater of control. To the Roman people, these marriages blurred reality with grotesque spectacle. In a society that valued masculinity, strength, and discipline, the emperor's behavior seemed like an insult to Roman identity itself. Yet, beneath the outrage was a truth few dared to admit. Nero had revealed the fragile nature of social norms. If the emperor could marry a man and still command armies, then what truly defined power, tradition, or authority? The tragedy of Sporus did not end with Nero. After Nero's downfall, when he was declared a public enemy and driven to suicide in 68 AD, Sporus's fate took another dark turn. General Otho, one of Nero's short-lived successors, took Sporus as his companion. To him as well, Sporus's resemblance to Poppaea was irresistible. The young man was once again forced into a role not of his choosing, becoming a living ghost of Nero's lost wife. Later, Sporus was dragged into the cruel spectacle of the Emperor Vitellius. In a grotesque parody, Vitellius planned to have Sporus play the role of a maiden in a theatrical performance where he would be assaulted publicly. Facing this humiliation, Sporus chose suicide over degradation. His death was a tragic end to a life consumed by the lust and cruelty of Rome's rulers. Nero's marriage to Sporus, then, was not merely a private scandal. It was a symbol of how absolute power can distort human lives, bending them into grotesque shapes for the amusement of rulers. Sporus's fate reflected the dark truth of imperial Rome, that the desires of one man could erase the freedom, dignity, and identity of another. Yet, in a strange way, Nero's actions also revealed a side of Rome often hidden beneath its marble facades. They exposed the fluidity of identity, the blurred lines between male and female, husband and wife, ruler and performer. Nero's marriage may have been condemned by his contemporaries, but it forced Rome to confront its own contradictions about gender, power, and morality. Some modern historians argue that Nero was not mad but calculated. By breaking taboos so publicly, he sent a message that he was untouchable. His rule was not bound by tradition, but by his will alone. If he could marry a man in front of all Rome and face no rebellion, then he was more than emperor, he was absolute. In this reading, the marriage to Sporus was less about love and more about power. Others, however, see Nero as a man consumed by guilt and desire. Having killed the woman he loved, he sought to recreate her in Sporus, clinging to a distorted memory through obsession. In this sense, the marriage was less political theater and more psychological tragedy, a glimpse into the broken soul of a man who could command the world but not control himself. The story of Nero and Sporus has echoed through the centuries, not just as gossip but as a reflection on human nature. It asks timeless questions. What happens when desire collides with power? When love becomes obsession? When the lives of others are reshaped by the will of one who sees himself as divine? These are not just Roman questions, they are questions of every age where rulers forget their humanity. In Rome's long history, filled with emperors who conquered nations, reformed laws, and built monuments, Nero stands out not for what he built but for what he destroyed: tradition, morality, and the dignity of his own office. His reign was a performance, his throne a stage, and his legacy a script of madness etched in scandal. And at the heart of that performance stood Sporus, the unwilling bride of Rome's most infamous emperor. The image of Nero leading Sporus through Rome, calling him his empress, still burns in history like a torch. To some, it is a symbol of decadence, proof that Rome was doomed to collapse under the weight of its own excess. To others, it is a reminder of the complexity of desire, the ways in which love, power, and cruelty can intertwine to create stories stranger than any fiction. While Nero's empire crumbled after his death, his story lived on, retold by historians, whispered by poets, and reimagined by playwrights. Each retelling magnified the scandal, painting Nero as either a monster or a madman. But the truth, as always, is far more complicated. Nero was not just a tyrant, but also a man whose deepest desires shaped the fate of an empire. For centuries, Christian writers used Nero as the ultimate symbol of corruption, some even casting him as the Antichrist in apocalyptic visions. His marriage to a man became one of many examples used to depict him as a ruler who defied God and nature. In this way, his scandal was magnified, ensuring that his name would forever be linked with sin and destruction. Yet, in modern times, the story takes on new interpretations. Some see Nero's defiance of gender norms as strangely progressive, an early, if twisted, example of breaking rigid social roles. Others see it only as exploitation, where Sporus's suffering overshadows any notion of liberation. What cannot be denied is that Nero forced Rome and the world to remember him in a way no ordinary ruler ever could. Power and desire are two forces that, when combined, can build empires or burn them to the ground. Nero embodied both in their most extreme form. His marriage to Sporus was not just a scandal, it was a symbol of what happens when the throne becomes a stage, and the ruler becomes both actor and director in a play no one dares interrupt. In the end, Nero died not in the grand palaces of Rome but in hiding, abandoned by his allies, whispering that the world had lost a great artist. Yet his art was painted in scandal and cruelty, leaving behind a legacy as infamous as it is unforgettable. His love for Sporus, if love it can be called, was part of that legacy, a tale of desire twisted into tragedy. And so, the story of Nero, the emperor who married a man, remains one of history's most shocking chapters. It is the story of an empire where power turned into theater, where lust blurred with authority, and where one man's obsession became another man's fate. Rome remembered Nero not as a great builder, nor as a wise ruler, but as the king who dared to call a man his bride, and in that act, revealed both the madness and the fragility of absolute power.